I would like to thank Richard Driehaus, the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, and the jury for the 2013 Richard A. Driehaus Prize for the great honor given to me today. Also, I'd like to welcome you to Chicago, my home for most of my life, which in many ways is responsible for whatever success I've enjoyed in the architectural profession. My intention today is to share with you my memory of my education and evolution as an architect. I've been aware of architecture my entire life, as I was born in Oak Park outside Chicago and raised in River Forest, where we lived next door to the Ingalls House by Frank Lloyd Wright. We, however, lived in the Queen Anne House, built in 1868. Thus, from very early on, I had suspicions about that low, dark house I could look down on from our second-floor windows. I wondered where it had come from. Because I knew I wanted to be an architect, I finished secondary education and applied to architecture schools. As an undergraduate, I was fortunate to have remarkable teachers at Cornell University School of Architecture and also at Yale for my final year of graduate study. When I arrived at Cornell, the competition was fierce and the schedule relentless. I had classmates whom I learned a great deal from, among them Alan Chimickoff, Steve Peterson, and Tom Schumacher. And the arrival of new faculty, the Texas Rangers as they were called, Lee Hodgson, Werner Seligman, John Shaw, John Haydock, and Colin Rowe, transformed the school completely. I encountered John Haydock as our studio head my 5th year. He showed a personal interest in each student's design based on common understanding, a pact between the student and the instructor that insisted on development of the project according to contract. This ensured a great deal of diversity within the studio and a personal attachment by each student to his project. John worked in a small office adjoining our studio, drawing one of his experimental houses while managing to give 2 or 3 desk crits a day. From this experience, I came to understand the amount of personal energy and commitment necessary in order to teach effectively, as well as to create an architecture project of highest quality. For my undergraduate thesis, I was a student of Colin Rowe. By this time, Colin's influence was universal within the school. We all had a firm belief that historical precedent was a prerequisite of good design, and the formal properties of buildings were supreme, although the relation between cultural ideas and form remained significant. So leaving Cornell, I had been exposed to a comparative and analytical method that carefully scrutinized classical architecture, looking for precedent, but did not allow the drawing of historical detail as part of the design process. Upon completing my undergraduate studies, I arrived in New Haven for graduate study to discover that Yale was not at all like Cornell. The love of history gained at Cornell drove me in courses in architectural history. Vincent Scully was astounding to me in the breadth of his knowledge that encompassed architecture in its totality, from its cultural roots, social intent, and formal arrangement to its engagement with the landscape. I did a lot of reading at this time and spent hours talking to friends in the class. Alan Greenberg was one of them. We exchanged opinions on topics that ranged from Lutyens, whom Alan was dissecting at the time, to ornament that I was obsessively investigating for a paper in Vincent Scully's class. This paper was the basis of most of the personal research that I pursued after I left school. My decision of where to complete my apprenticeship after graduating from Yale was becoming quite clear to me. I felt the need to return to my origins, and in my mind, I decided that Chicago possessed the missing piece in the puzzle regarding the fractured discipline that had once been architecture. Here in the home of Burnham, Sullivan, Wright, and Mies should be found the secrets of a once universal truth. I joined the firm of C.F. Murphy Associates, the group that had built the Chicago Civic Center, and was soon to be under the control of Gene Summers, the former manager of Mises' office for the previous 16 years. My education through apprenticeship now began in earnest. From Gene, I learned how to design and draw Misesian buildings, but more importantly, I learned how to be an architect and an effective professional. Following my internship at C.F. Murphy from 1965 to 1971, I was invited by James Hammond of Hammond & Roche, a small but highly respected Misesian firm, to join him as a design partner of the firm. From him, I learned in detail the enormous effort it took to sustain a small office in a competitive market. I also learned to understand his professional integrity and even-handed dealings with all those involved in the complex business of building, from the clients to engineers to contractors. But most of all, I learned to appreciate all those within our own venture who contribute to the quality of the firm's work. I've remained at HBRA for over 40 years and continue to have the greatest respect for the talents of my professional colleagues and their years of dedication. The practice of architecture was often consuming, but I felt a burning desire to pursue the self-education that had begun at Yale. Long days and nights, as well as many weekends, were spent at work. The rides on the subway were spent reading what I thought I needed to know to become a truly educated person. I thought the 5-year undergraduate life in architecture school had robbed me of a liberal arts education. Long commutes were filled studying novels, poems, and theoretical works on art history. I struggled with rudimentary books of philosophy, beginning with existentialism, often finding it difficult to stay awake on the train. While I learned to build in detail buildings at work on my own time, I studied again the 19th century origins of modernism, particularly related to the first Chicago School of Architecture. At this point, my inquiry focused, and I began a series of articles on Wright that explored the imaginative foundation of his architectural imagery, beginning with Welsh fairy tales, followed by the direct representation of nature in his work. My final piece on Wright dealt with close reading of Emerson's essay, Nature, related to the design of Unity Temple. All of these articles attempted to answer the question of representation and search for hidden sources of creativity. At the same time, I was examining Mies at an identical level of detail. I traced the lineage of German neoclassicism from Schinkel to Behrens to Mies and wrote several articles related to the curriculum at IIT under Mies's direction. I compared the writings and drawings of Rudolf Schwarz, the German church architect, to Mies's architecture at IIT in an attempt to show that Mies was interested in spiritual representation. I completed a piece for Perspective, the Yale Architectural Journal, analyzing the Commons building at IIT to reveal irrational moments in the design process and construction that questioned Mies's interest in true technological architecture. In 1976, the Chicago 7 formed to sponsor a series of exhibits and events designed to create a forum within the architectural community where new ideas could be discussed in order to raise the level of debate within the profession. The founding group of architects include myself and Larry Booth, Stuart Cohn, Jim Freed, Jim Nagel, Stanley Tigerman, and Ben Weiss. Our activities began with a drawing show at the Richard Gray Gallery in Chicago. My House of Virgil project attempted to infuse architecture once again with representational imagery through a narrative related directly to Virgil's Return of the Golden Age, utilizing a collage of vernacular architectural ruins, genuine historical fragments, and modern constructions. The colored drawings were rendered to resemble classic romantic paintings of the 19th century. I learned that I learned what would have been impossible experimentation in built form could be explored completely in drawing. This proved to be another unanticipated lesson for my mentor, John Haydock. There followed the Townhouse exhibit in Chicago at Rona Hoffman's gallery. My final design was presented as a model resembling a dollhouse in scale. This time I went one step further in blending traditional form with modern construction. Designs of the entire structure were based on the Maison Domino of Le Corbusier, overlaid with a metric grid of Mies establishing the modular basis for the internal development of the space, which is drawn from spatial typologies of Palladian palaces. With this endeavor, I was closer to a genuine hybrid of classical and modern tendencies to the point where the project was geometrically exact and doubly coded as both a modern and a classical, while remaining buildable in a real-world sense. The next exhibit I was involved in was sponsored by the Walker Art Museum in Minneapolis and was focused on issues of urban design. My proposal dealt with the imagery of cities in relationship to their cultural context. Each of the 4 drawings contained an allegorical female figure symbolizing the ethos of the period, surrounded by secondary mythical figures supporting their relation to society. The first drawing portrays the classical city of Greece, protected by the warrior gods, dwelling in the magical place in nature, built for man. The final drawing shows Chicago incrementally discarding the tragic forms of past cities to signify a secular world devoid of meaning. Death reigns, and a miraculous child offers possibility that the classical city could return through its reinvention. Beside writing and drawing, I had begun teaching in 1973 at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where I absorbed a great deal from both faculty and students, furthering my attempts to form a coherent theory for my work that might be both poetic and rationally built. George Danforth, Myron Goldsmith, and Fazlur Khan were willing to generously share their understanding of Mies with me at this point. Following years at IIT, I became the director of the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois in Chicago in 1979. Here again, fellow faculty members, especially Stanley Tigerman and Stuart Cohn, provided endless energy to the school and the students while offering a sounding board for evolving ideas. After 6 years as the director of the school at UIC, I accepted the dean's position at the School of Architecture in Yale in 1985, necessitating a move to New Haven while the architectural practice remained in Chicago. I reestablished my relationship to Vincent Scully, who now was less of a modernist, and I became a colleague of Kent Bloomer, the only ornamentalist I know who would be such an ally in the years to follow. During this period of weekly commutes, our firm decided to undertake the competition from the Harold Washington Library Center in the Chicago Loop. This was a hazardous financial risk for a firm of our size, but I saw it as an opportunity to actually build a major public building incorporating the ideas I had been pursuing for the last 20 years through not only building, but also writing, drawing, and teaching. At last, this was the moment, for the competition was a test to see if my personal research would hold up in the harsh realities of the built world in Chicago. At this point, I returned to two books I had encountered at Yale as a graduate student, The Shapes of Time by George Kubler and The Anxiety of Influence by Harold Bloom. Kubler replaces style as a static concept of form with the idea of linked successions of works based on the appearance of prime objects and their replications. Interestingly, Kubler chooses Chicago after the fire in 1871 as an exemplary location for heightened artistic activity in architecture due to the amassing of vast wealth accompanied by a flux of talented, ambitious architects such as Burnham and Root, Adler and Sullivan, and later Frank Lloyd Wright. Kubler suggests a normative time frame for the evolution of a formal sequence to be two linked 60-year periods, the first 60 years for formulation, the second 60 years for application. Through this reasoning, the first Chicago school of Burnham and Sullivan would extend from the fire to the Depression. The second Chicago school of Mies van der Rohe, C.F. Murphy, and Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill would extend to the end of the 20th century. And it was obvious to me that, in Kubler's terms, I was making a late individual entry into a highly successful historical sequence that had almost exhausted its resources. However, it occurred to me, because of the excessive richness of the tradition, it might be possible there were still open lines of creative exploration that had been abandoned due to the rapid transformation. I was reminded at the turn of the 20th century, architecture changed from an ornamented art to an abstract, unadorned expression. I turned to Harold Bloom for guidance. Bloom posits in the introduction to The Anxiety of Influence that poetic history is held to be indistinguishable from poetic influence, since strong poets make that history by misreading one another so as to clear imaginative space for themselves. I believe that architecture follows this same pattern, that all architecture is actually transformed from past architecture. Bloom describes strategies which he terms as swerves in order to allow later creators to overcome their strong predecessor. Following Bloom's thoughts, so quote, "Now, the first swerve is to learn to read a great precursor as his descendants compelled themselves to read him," end quote. This would explain the relationship between Richardson to Burnham and Root, Adler and Sullivan, and Wright. Another quote, "The second is to read the descendants as if we were disciples, and so compel ourselves to learn where we must revise them if we are to be found by our own work, unquote. This would equate with Mies's relation to the first Chicago school and my relationship to them all. I decided that I would follow the trajectory taken by Mies in the direction of rational planning to his point of abstract classicism, and then swerve to accommodate Sullivan's suggestion that architecture should abandon ornament for a period to geometrically clarify its overall vision, and then return to ornament with heightened understanding. My task was clear to me now. I had to flesh out the skin and bones that I had inherited from Mies with the language of his predecessors in Chicago. When the program for the library was issued, we had only 4 months to design, detail, and specify an 800,000 square foot building for pricing, as this was a design-build competition. We knew we wanted to honor the Burnham plan for Chicago, as the site was bounded on the south by Congress Parkway, the central axis of Burnham's plan. We wished to honor his massing of buildings as uniform, full-block volumes, defining the streets as public corridors. We intended to create a representational building that spoke to the architectural history of the city in a direct manner through form, materiality, and ornamentation. It was to be a monumental public building for Chicago, with the full support of our team members, Bob Wislow, the developer, and Dick Halpern, the contractor. We began to draw. Our focus immediately was drawn to the Marshall Field Wholesale store by H.H. Richardson, completed in 1886. The building, now gone, had inspired the young and ambitious architects of the time to emulate its power and grace. Both Louis Sullivan and John Wellborn Root were deeply influenced, as evidenced by their almost contemporary auditorium theater of Adler and Sullivan and the Rookery building of Burnham and Root. The later buildings of Sullivan also affect us in many ways. The simplified volumes and the more abstract forms of the banks moved us in their forthright simplicity. However, the most astounding aspect of these small structures was the highly articulate ornaments that played off their rudimentary geometry and arched openings. The ornaments on the banks were scaled up to the point where they almost overwhelmed the parent building, but always stopped short of destructive disruption of the architectural composition. As we began to plan the building, we realized the program called for a completely flexible arrangement of partitions of book stacks that could be altered at will over the life of the building. The modular planning methodology of Mies would ensure that metric continuity could be maintained throughout the building. We knew that this technical grid could serve as the basis for an overall arithmetic ornamental field governing the distribution of ornaments. For as I had discovered in my earlier investigations, the architecture of Mies was based on classical methodology of ornamentation. We realized that the later buildings of Daniel Burnham following the World's Fair of 1892 were both rationally conceived and ornamentally perfected. They exhibited a modular regularity of the parts, a repetition of manufactured assemblies, as well as systematic approach to classical ornament that allowed it to be coordinated with steel frame construction. On detailed examination of these classical structures from the first Chicago school, there's an obvious ancestral relationship to the more generalized buildings of Mies and his followers from the second Chicago School of Architecture that were constructed 100 years later. As you might know, our firm won the competition, built the building in time and on budget. We resumed our practice with new understanding of the nature of architecture as a discipline, for we had realigned ourselves with the historical origins of the profession as well as the history of building in Chicago. We like to believe that we had created imaginative space for ourselves and others to engage Mies, Wright, Sullivan, and Burnham in a continuing dialogue on the nature of built form in this place at this time. Finally, I would like to close with a quote from the 20th century philosopher Karl Jaspers, whom I discovered a long time ago while reading on the subway and still find pertinent today. It's the quote now. The content of our truth depends upon our appropriating the historical foundation. Our own power of generation lies in the rebirth of what has been handed down to us. If we do not wish to slip back, nothing must be forgotten. A bit of philosophizing is to be genuine. Our thoughts must arise from our own source. The more determinedly I exist as myself within the conditions of the time, the more clearly I shall hear the language of the past, the nearer I shall feel the glow of life." Unquote. Thank you very much.